Hello, my name is Otaviano Canuto, and I'm a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. This is the first of a series of short videos dealing with subjects covered in my recent book, Climbing a High Ladder Development in the Global Economy. Today, the topic is trade globalization. Let me start by referring to a triple shock happening in the 90s and 2000s in the global economy. Those shocks kind of represented a shift of tectonic plates in the global economy. The first one is the shock associated with a downfall of labor prices, reflecting the sudden incorporation of workers whose labor service were previously not integrated into the global market economy. That evolved into a supply shock emanating from an increase in the number of manufacturing workers engaged in international trade. I'm obviously referring to the demolition of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as well as of China already before it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Two important complementary changes also took place. Trade opening. There was a very broad movement towards reduction of trade barriers, of trade tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers. And there was also a cluster of technological breakthroughs in information and communication technologies and in transportation that facilitated exactly the incorporation of that labor force. The transportation change that I'm referring to is what has been called the containerization, which reduced dramatically the possibility of transporting inputs and final products. And both the ICT change, the evolution of information and communication technologies and transportation, allowed for a fragmentation of manufacturing processes and the relocation of parts of value chains according to convenience, including the use of cheaper labor in some parts of those value chains. So the phenomenon of integration of Asia into global or regional value chains that was already at play in some countries in the previous decades was taken to a larger scope. Now, we also had a financial shock associated with the downward trend of long-term real interest rates particularly in the advanced economies, but which also spurred financial globalization. But that's the subject for another day. We also had another third basic price shock associated with the increase in the global demand for primary goods. Lifting the price of natural resource. This reflected the relatively high commodity intensity of imports of the larger rising South countries, particularly China. The result was a rise in commodity price, really unusually vigorous upswing phase of a commodity supercycle. For commodity exporters, including Latin America and the Caribbean, this shock was associated with terms of trade gains, but also this is subject for another day. But let me show you how significant was the impact of this process by looking at the evolution of trade, of world trade, as a share of GDP. Look, as you can see in the chart, production and trade globalization thrived from 90 onwards. This reflected, as I said, the removal of barriers to trade and technological advance that led to reduction in trade and communication costs, plus the incorporation of cheap labor. And this led to years of sustained trade expansion. Look at the blue lines in the chart. The decline in the costs of shipping goods and of managing complex production networks allowed the vertical and spatial cross-border fragmentation of manufacturing within highly integrated global production networks or global value chains, where large swaths of lower wage workers from Asia and Eastern Europe could be combined with the use of technology managed across borders. That's why Professor Richard Baldwin has differentiated this. Professor Richard Baldwin from the Geneva uh, Institute has differentiated globalization 2.0, but this more recent phase, versus globalization 1.0, the one that is depicted in the first wave, in the sense that the first wave was because of the revolution in transportation costs and revolution in technology with the steam ships and so on. It became possible to transport final goods, manufacturing goods, and so on, and establish a labor division as the one accompany the expansion of trade in the first wave. The second one allowed for the fragmentation and transportation of components. So ideas could be transported outside cross-border. That's why Professor Baldwin refers to this as a globalization 2.0, different from the first one. So for the global value chains facilitated a process of growth come structural transformation with substantial total factor productivity increases in the countries wherein they stretched. Foreign trade was instrumental for the substantial movement of population from low value, low productivity activities to the production of modern tradable goods. And this appears exactly in the following chart, where you can see how there was an intensive relocation of manufacturing production, particularly to Asia. And also the chart displays the relative loss of manufacturing value added in high income countries. China represents a special case, both in terms of speed and magnitude, but it's broadly regarding Asia, sometime also happening to other regions. Now, this had a profound impact in the structure of the global economy. Let me just show you using this chart. Look, in a nutshell, GDP growth was higher over those decades, and it took place with an increasing weight of non-advanced economies. As I said, this is one of the reasons for the commodity supercycle in the 2000s and the transmission of global dynamism to natural resource-rich countries. And in the left-hand side of the chart shows the rising share of emerging markets and developing economies in the contributions to increments of world GDP, at the margin, a rising share. The right-hand side, which focus on the decade after the global financial crisis, it indeed exhibits a decline in the differential of growth rates of emerging markets and developing economies relative to advanced economies after the global financial crisis. The overenthusiasm about the possibility of a switchover of global locomotives at the time of the global financial crisis, which led the one who's speaking to you to write about it in a book by 2010, faded out. We will discuss why another day. But it's still the positive growth differential remains, even if very much different from region to region. And in any case, let me show you a very important figure. One may claim success with respect to reduction of poverty in all regions, as you can see, to different degrees. But this is a remarkable success. So the success was in both changing north-south shares of world GDP and also in reducing poverty, particularly in the East Asia and the Pacific region, but also some in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, to some extent, and the Eastern Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Middle East and North Africa. Now, a point to be remarked now is the fact that there have been signs that the strong wave has kind of reached its peak. You can see it in the chart by looking at how trade evolved dramatically until the global financial crisis. And after the global financial crisis, 2009, 2010, it returns to growth, but at a very slower pace than before. Of course, at the end of the chart, you see already the signs of the ongoing pandemic crisis, with a slight recovery expected by the WTO for this year, for 2021, but it's still very far from the dynamism of before. The elasticity of global trade relative to global GDP has been dampened by more than what the circumstantial post-global financial crisis trade dampening factors would suggest. Hypothesis: given the state of arts of manufacturing technology, the unbundling and fragmentation of production processes may have approached a plateau. Can this be extended to service? Still to be seen, but at least the opportunities fully exploited over the 2 decades of globalization 2.0 kind of have reached a plateau. And let's say, one may say that a major wave of trade cum structural transformation has passed, with China now rebalancing as a special case. But that's the subject for another video. But there is also the fact that the advanced economies are becoming increasingly service economies, and the intensity of foreign trade, particularly with respect to southern countries, except for tourism, is smaller, is lower, the elasticity as compared to the manufacturing. But there's also the fact that the scope for export-led hypergrowth has narrowed, as the pattern of current account imbalances prevailing prior to the global financial crisis is unlikely to return. That's the subject for another video. And the directions taken by technological trajectories and aggregate demand, as I said, in advanced economies, seem to point toward a broad alteration of the balance of location advantage for production fragments, decreasing the weight of labor costs and augmenting the relevance of local availability of complementary intangible assets. What do I mean by technological trajectories? Industry 4.0, a broad name for the combination of AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, is labor saving, particularly on the content of unskilled labor, but also some medium range skills that in the case of in terms of impact of Industry 4.0. The customization of products is also raising the relevance of proximity to markets over production costs. On the demand side, the domestic consumption and GDP in the advanced economies are dematerializing as a reflection of technological change and the higher income elasticity of demand for sophisticated service. So these and other trends suggest that a double whammy on production and exports of non-advanced economies may take place: a partial reversal of offshoring and a slower growth of outlets for the typical exports. We're not talking about a collapse. There's not anything like this. Among other reasons, because as the chart shows, this varies by sector. And it also does not lead necessarily to absence of local manufacturing production in southern countries. The the possibility of micro manufacturing locally and for catering to domestic markets is something quite possible as an unfolding of the Industry 4.0. But the point that we want to make is that the exceptional export-led growth, like the Chinese, has become harder to obtain. And also there are the trends relative to service that we need to highlight. It's what has been called the rising servicification of manufacturing. That is to say, manufacturing is increasingly embodying and embedding service, while the share of component manufacturing and final assembly in value added declines. The chart compares the configuration of value chains and the presence of service between the 70s and what seems to be the path now and ahead. The relevance of embodied service in manufacturing products has risen either as inputs, as the chart refers to, design, marketing, distribution costs, etc., or as trade enablers, the role of logistics service or e-commerce platforms. Furthermore, besides the embodiment, service are increasingly embedding service that come bundled with or added to manufactured products. The best illustration for this is the case of the apps for mobile device and software solutions for smart factories. In sum, the challenge to achieve simultaneously employment of unskilled workers and substantial increase of productivity are becoming taller. Furthermore, it's important to highlight that those horizontal productivity and competitiveness factors, including the local accumulation of capabilities, low transaction costs, infrastructure improvement, that were crucial for any broad and deep manufacturing-led development, that was the case in Asia, are now extended to service. There is more complementarity than substitutability between productivity and competitiveness factors between manufacturing and service. So there is no alternative but to raise the bar domestically if a developing country wants to enjoy any of these as engines of growth. One novelty vis-a-vis everything that we have discussed is the One Belt, One Road initiative, or however you want to, whichever the option of denomination beside that. China is moving to expand its economy outside. So it's kind of an overlapping or parallel, if they don't intermingle, globalization 2.0. In this case now, having China as its core and adding, of course, the technologies that we were talking about as being at the frontier. So much for trade globalization or globalization 2.0. The content of this video is further developed in chapters 9 to 12 of this book that you can find on those places. Stay tuned.